Shalom. So today we're going to be talking about this little disagreement that we see in the book of Galatians. And this is going to be a multi-part study because I think that just by taking what we see in Galatians and comparing it to Acts and a few other sources, I think we can see that there's something going on here that most commentators, whether they're priests or preachers or pastors, that they don't really want to have to deal with. How could Paul, basically according to his own words, get up in the face of Peter over some issue? Paul never met Yeshua. Kepha was one of the three primary disciples. The same way that the Essene sects would have 12 disciples under a master, and then 3 of them that were like the head disciples. You see the same thing with Yeshua, and so of course Kepha was one of them. Paul even admits that they seem to be pillars. That him, Kepha, James, and John seem to be pillars within the early assembly. So we're going to get into this. We're going to look at it. Unfortunately, it's not something that you can just do real quick because there's a lot of details. And Paul's given us his side of the story. And I think the author of Acts is trying to gloss over what happened as best he could, but we can kind of read between the lines and figure out some of what's going on. Especially if we believe that Luke was one that wrote Acts, and so he knew Paul personally, and he was probably even at Antioch when this whole episode happened with Galatians. So Paul's writing the book of Galatians after some sort of incident involving Kepha. And so what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to get to the rest of the story. If you've ever listened to Paul Harvey, may his name be a blessing. That's one of the things that he always talked about trying to get to. So we're going to see if we can find the rest of the story. So we start off here, and so Kepha is kind of setting the stage, Paul is kind of setting the stage in the opening chapter of Galatians. He says, Saul, an emissary, not from men, nor by a man, but by Yeshua Messiah, and Elohim, the Father, who raised him from the dead. So this is kind of a theme that he's going to continue on for the next few verses, that he did not get his doctrine from men. He says, I marvel that you are so readily turning from him who called you into the favor of Messiah to a different gospel, or a different good news, which is not another, only there are some who are troubling you and wishing you to pervert the good news of Messiah. Okay, so stopping right here, who is the him? You're turning away from him. Well, it appears that the him is Paul. He's basically saying, I marvel that you are so readily turning away from me, who called you into the favor of Messiah, to a different gospel. But then he goes on to say, which is not another, it's not another gospel, only that there are some who are troubling you and wishing to pervert the gospel of Messiah. Okay, so it's not that somebody's teaching a different Yeshua necessarily. It's just that the terms of the arrangement are different. And we'll get into that a little bit, further along. But he says, however, even if we or a messenger out of heaven bring a gospel to you besides what we announce to you, let him be accursed. So there's this, controversy going on between Paul and his followers and some other group. So he says, let him be accursed. As we have said before, and now I say again, if anyone brings a good news or a gospel to you besides what you have received, in other words, what you've received directly from Paul, let this other messenger be accursed. He says, For do I now persuade men or Elohim? Or do I seek to please men? For if I still pleased men, I should not be a servant of Messiah. And I make known to you, brothers, that the good news, or the gospel, announced by me is not according to man. For I did not receive it from a man, nor was I taught it, but through a revelation of Yeshua Messiah. Okay, so he's being pretty specific here. Now, he did not get this from a man, and you can see it here in the even the opening verse, and now for the last 10 verses, he's kind of reinforced this idea that this is his gospel. It doesn't come from someone else, except for he had this appearance of Yeshua. So he goes, you're turning away from him. The him, of course, is, in Paul's words, me, because there are some men who are, according to Paul, perverting the gospel. So who are these men? That's kind of the mystery, because Paul... Now, why would Paul not want to come right out and tell us? He eventually does, but he does it in a roundabout way. And so the question is, why would you not just come out and tell who it was? Well, it's because he doesn't... whoever it is could, in some way, harm or hinder Paul if Paul came out and said it directly. It's kind of like if you're at work and your boss tells you that you need to make sure you're not taking an extra long break, and so then you're sitting in the break room with your coworkers, and you're like, oh, well, I guess I need to hurry up and get back to work because someone's been getting on to me for being late coming back from a break. You can't come out and call your boss out by name because you don't want it getting back to him. So you kind of allude to who it is. And I think that's part of what's going on here with Paul. He keeps talking about some people do this, or someone did that, or said that. But he doesn't openly call these people out by name, at least not initially. I think his emotions end up getting the better of him, and he ends up exposing who they are. But I really think if Paul had taken a little bit more time writing this letter, after his emotions had settled down, we probably would have no idea who this is. But he goes on to say, for you have heard of my former way of life in Jerusalem, and then he goes on to kind of boast about how awesome he was as a Jew. And he says, but when it pleased Elohim, who separated me from my mother's womb, and called me by his favor, to reveal his Son in me, that I may bring him the good news to the Gentiles. I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood. Here again, this emphasis on not from a man. Neither did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were emissaries before me. Now we're getting somewhere. But I went to Arabia and returned again to Damascus. Now this doesn't quite parallel with what we see written about in Acts, but we'll get into that in an upcoming video. I just want to point out that he says several things here. First of all, there's this statement, he separated me from my mother's womb. Now, one of the things that was known about James, or said about James, is that James was wholly from his mother's womb, which means, generally, it's also used the same way with John the Baptist. He was essentially saying that he was a Nazarite from the womb of his mother. And just by studying what the Essenes believed and looking at the connection between the early Jewish Christian groups, we can kind of narrow down what this means to be sanctified from your mother's womb. And so that would mean that you did not eat meat, you did not eat strong drink or alcohol, didn't come near a dead body, essentially a Nazarite vow. So it's almost like it's almost like Paul now is kind of claiming that for himself too. He separated me from my mother's womb. Now we know that's not true about Paul because he wasn't set apart from his mother's womb, but he's kind of like grabbing onto the coattails of James, or he's kind of like boasting about himself to bring himself up to that same level, to make himself equal to James. And we'll see this, manifest itself a little bit more as we go along. But we know that Paul was, he was violent. He was attacking the men of the assembly. He even was responsible for the death of some of the believers before his apparent conversion on the road to Damascus. So it's hard for him to really claim to be set apart from his mother's womb. And that's not necessarily what he's claiming. He's saying that he separated me from my mother's womb. It's almost like a way of saying he was holy from his mother's womb without actually saying it. He called me by his favor to reveal his Son in me. So essentially, and you can see this in more detail in other of Paul's epistles, but he basically claims to have Yeshua literally possessing his body. And I say that and people will scoff at it, but if you really look at what he says, not really here, but in some of his other letters, you'll see that that's essentially what he's claiming. And something that Christians say all the time. They say, well, I got Messiah in me, but I don't think Paul meant it the same way that most Christians mean it. He said he did not immediately consult with flesh and blood, neither did he go up to Jerusalem to those who were emissaries before me. So now we're getting a kind of a clue as to who he has an issue with. Then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to learn from Kepha and remained with him for 15 days. And I saw no one other than the emissaries. And I saw no, I'm sorry, having trouble reading today. And I saw no other of the emissaries except Yaakov, the brother of the Master. Now, if you read some of the early church fathers, they'll refer to James as the brother of Yeshua, but they always kind of like throw in a qualifier there. They'll be like, he was called the brother of the Master, but he wasn't really the brother of Yeshua. He was just adopted, or he was a brother from another mother, or something like that. But Paul's not doing. Paul has no problem saying that James was the brother of Yeshua. There was no perpetual virginity of Mary doctrine at the time Paul was writing this. He says, and what I write to you, see, before Elohim I do not lie. Now this is something else you see all through Paul's epistles. He's constantly defending himself against lying. The only time that you have to constantly defend yourself against lying is if somebody is accusing you of lying. But he says, I do not lie. Although it is odd that a lot of this story he's telling about how he went up to visit the other apostles in Jerusalem, or the apostles in Jerusalem, it doesn't quite parallel with what we see in the book of Acts. So either there's some disconnect between him and what Luke wrote in Acts. Like I said, we'll get into that in a future video, but it says, then I went up into the districts of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still not known by sight to the assemblies of Yehuda, and so on and so forth. He says, then after 14 years I again went up to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along too, and I went up by revelation and laid before them the good news which I proclaim among the Gentiles, but separately to those who were esteemed, lest somehow I run, or had run in vain. But not even Titus, who was with me, though a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. So he's going up to consult with people who he says, those who were esteemed, or those who were in a position of authority. He continues on and said, now verses 4 and 5, they're kind of an aside. They're not really, he's giving you the reason why he went up. He says, this matter arose because of false brothers sneakily brought in, who sneaked in to spy out our freedom, which we have in Messiah, Yeshua, in order to enslave us. To these we did not yield in subjection, not even for an hour, so that the truth of the good news remains in you. So, for right now, we could take out verse 4 and 5 because they're not really part of the narrative. He's just explaining the reason why he went up to Jerusalem. So we can take that out. And so going back to the end of verse 2 says, those who were esteemed, lest somehow I ran or had run in vain, but not even Titus who was with me, though a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. But from those who were esteemed to be whatever, what they were, it makes no difference to me. Elohim shows no partiality, for those who were esteemed contributed nothing to me. But on the contrary, when they saw the good news to the uncircumcised, had been entrusted to me, even as Kepha to the circumcised, for he who worked in Kepha to make him an emissary to the circumcision also worked in me for the Gentiles. Okay, so what is he saying here? So the people who were in authority in verse 2, when he mentions them again, he's returning from the aside, and he says, but those who were esteemed, same people, same group of people he mentioned in verse 2, he then immediately follows up with, but whatever they were, it made no difference to me. So whoever these people are that are in authority, obviously Paul does not view them as superiors. He doesn't really care about them, it's just that they're in some kind of position of authority, so therefore he has to go up there to see them for some reason. Because, and again he repeats it, that they didn't contribute anything to him. They contributed nothing to me. I did not get my doctrine through flesh and blood. I was not taught it by men. And so then he says, so when Yaakov, or James, this would have been James, the brother of Yeshua, so when James, Kepha, and John, Yochanan, who seemed to be pillars. Now a lot of people read this and they're like, Paul's admitting that they're pillars. Well, kind of, but look at the way it's said. He says they seem to be pillars. So he's not actually admitting that they are the pillars of the assembly. He's just saying they seem to be, in this position. These guys who seemed to be pillars came to know the favor that had been given to me. They gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship in order that we go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised, only that we might remember the poor, or the Ebionim, which I myself was eager to do. Okay, so what do we got here? So they was, obviously, or at least it's obvious to me, that the they is Yaakov, Kepha, and Yochanan. They are the people that Paul's going up to see. And the same thing that he said about the they saw the good news that was entrusted to me for the uncircumcised. And then when he says Yaakov, Kepha, and Yochanan, they came to know the favor that had been given to me. So see, he's basically saying it the same way. The only thing that's changed is now he's revealing who the they are. He's unmasking the names, essentially. But so they saw the good news. Yochanan, Kepha, and John saw the good news. So, they recognized that Paul had this special calling upon his life. Now, but here's the thing. If the they is Yaakov, Kepha, and Yochanan, they are also those who esteem to be whatever it was, it makes no difference to me. So even though he's going up to see these guys that, again, he says they seem to be pillars, he's kind of sideways mentioning that even though he's going up to see them, he really doesn't have any kind of respect for their authority or see them as any way having any kind of authority over him. Whatever they were made no difference to him because they didn't contribute anything to Paul. They're just more or less a formality that's in the way. So we see what he meant when he, mentioned earlier, it's not according to man, didn't receive it from man. Now who is the man? Well, now we know. He's talking about the apostles. He's talking about the 12 apostles. The 12 apostles contributed nothing to him. He doesn't care who they are. They don't mean anything to him. Moving on, it says, verse 11, and when Kepha had come to Antioch, I withstood him to his face because he was at fault. So again, this same theme about not respecting the apostles, you see it now manifesting in this disagreement with Kepha. So what triggered the disagreement? He says, for before some came to Yaakov, came from James, came from Yaakov. He was eating with the Gentiles, but when they came, he began to withdraw and separate himself in fear of those of the circumcision. And the rest of the Yehudim, or the rest of the Jews, joined him in hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led away by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not walking straight according to the good news, I said to Kepha before them all, if you being a Jew live as a Gentile and not as the Jews, why do you compel the Gentiles to live as Yehudim? In other words, this is where you get it, the Judaizing accusation. Anytime you try to obey Elohim, you're Judaizing. So, a few things I just want to point out. Again, he's saying some came from Yaakov. Again, the fact that he's not naming these people kind of indicates that for some reason he's not wanting to reveal who they are. And I would submit it's because they are people who are in a position of recognition with the rest of the body, and that if he starts going out and attacking them directly, he's kind of attacking them directly here, but he's mincing his words in a way so that it's difficult to really figure out what he's saying. And the proof of it is the fact is that most Christians will read this and not even catch on to what's going on here. They won't catch on to the fact that he's actually criticizing the apostles themselves. They read through it and think that there's some other group, there's some faction within the Jerusalem assembly called the circumcision that are causing trouble for Paul. But the thing is, if you look at all of his letters, and you look at the references from the other historical accounts of the church fathers, the circumcision, the party of the circumcision, was the Jerusalem assembly itself. It was not a faction within the Jerusalem assembly. Eusebius, in his ecclesiastical history, when he's speaking about James and the Jerusalem assembly, he refers to him as the circumcision. James was the bishop of the circumcision in Jerusalem. You can check that out. You can find a copy of Ecclesiastical History free in a PDF form online, and you can look it up yourself. So, we don't really know what happened with Kepha. All we know is it involves something where Kepha was having table fellowship, someone else shows up, and for whatever reason, Kepha withdraws himself. We have Paul's side of the story, but we don't have the other side of the story. We don't have... this is kind of a one-sided account. Judging by what we read about in the Nazarene Acts, Kepha speaks about table fellowship, and he speaks about how it's very important that you shouldn't have table fellowship with people who are not obeying the dietary commands. And for the Nazarenes, the dietary commands was not just eating kosher, but you didn't eat meat at all. And you certainly didn't eat meat sacrificed to an idol. Now, Kepha's here. In fact, in the Nazarene Acts, throughout the narrative, he's very careful about who he has table fellowship with. He only allowed Clement to have table fellowship with him after Clement had been with him for some period of time. He got to know Clement, and then Clement was immersed or baptized, and at that point they could have table fellowship together. And Kepha said, look, it's not because I think I'm better than you. I have to be very careful because of, and he goes into to speak about demonology and the way that evil spirits can attach themselves to certain foods. And even if you're not eating those foods, just sitting down at table fellowship is a covenant meal. And so you can't go into covenant with someone if you're not absolutely sure that they are pure as far as having any kind of unclean spirit. So it's very possible that Kepha was having table fellowship with these people that he thought were seasoned believers, and then these people show up from James, and he realizes, they maybe do some investigating or asking around, and they realize that these people that Kepha was eating with were not quite as, far along in the whole understanding that they thought they were. That maybe Paul was teaching them something different than the apostles taught. But for whatever reason, Kepha had to withdraw himself from table fellowship. Again, we don't know the reason. But when you read the Nazarene Acts, you can kind of get a picture of what may have been going on here. So, it says that he began to withdraw himself or separate himself in fear of the Jerusalem assembly, which is those of the circumcision. Now notice also that Paul admits that the rest of the Jews, including his right-hand man Barnabas, they turned away from him too. Paul did not win this argument. It was everybody against Paul. And judging from what Paul says in verse 14, he did not admit that he was wrong. Paul stuck to his guns. He lost his argument. Everyone else was against him. So regardless of what Paul says here, he admits that he was on one side and everyone else was on the other. Most people miss that, and they think that Kepha really got it handed to him and learned his lesson. But that's not what's happening here. Paul was the one that got rebuked. He says, and I'm not going to read all this, but, what is the issue? What is the issue that caused Kepha to withdraw? And you can see it. He says it over and over again here. It's highlighted in green. Works of the Torah, works of the Torah, works of the Torah. Through the Torah I died to Torah. Righteousness is through the Torah. Yada, yada, yada. The next page too. Works of Torah, works of Torah. Torah is under the curse. Cursed is everyone who does not continue in all that's been written in the book of the Torah. Blah, blah, blah. So it's pretty obvious what the problem was. The problem was something that had to do with Torah observance, which again comes back to what I was saying. My theory is that these people were not keeping the Torah. Kepha's having table fellowship with them. These guys show up from Jerusalem and say, hey, I was talking to this guy over here, and apparently they're not eating the way they're supposed to. They're not keeping the commandments like they're supposed to. And then Kepha's like, oh, crap, I've got to withdraw myself. I can't be sitting at the table with people who are not on the same page as us. So Kepha withdraws himself, and then that's where the problem comes in. Now we'll go through the rest of the book of Galatians briefly, just a high-level overview. If you read the Nazarene Acts, you know that Kepha is always referring to Paul as the enemy. He never even refers to him by name. It appears that Paul may even be aware of this. He says, so then if I become your enemy, speaking truth to you, they, speaking about the Jerusalem assembly, are ardent towards you for no good, but they wish to shut you out, that you may be ardent toward them. So again, the problem is the Jerusalem assembly. Circumcision seems to be a major issue here. He says, who is troubling you shall bear his judgment, whoever he is. Obviously, Paul knows who it is. He's just throwing this in, whoever it is, to give himself plausible deniability. Paul knows who it is. And he who is troubling you shall bear his judgment, whoever he is. And I, brothers, if I still proclaim circumcision, why am I still persecuted? Then the stumbling block of the stake has been set aside. Oh, that those who disturb you would even cut themselves off. So what's he saying there? He's saying that Paul is wishing that the people that are telling the Galatians that they need to be circumcised, he's saying that he wishes that the party of the circumcision would just go ahead and cut their private parts off. For you, brothers, have been called to freedom, do not use freedom as an occasion for the flesh, but through love serve one another. And he goes on to criticize circumcision because he says that that's an act of the flesh. And then he even goes so far as to compare it to immorality and fornication and all kind of other, these are the sins of the flesh. And he goes through a list of them all. Of course, he's comparing circumcision to that list, as if circumcision itself is some kind of fornication. Galatians 6:12, as many as wish to have a good show in the flesh, these compel you to be circumcised, only so that they should not be persecuted for the sake of Messiah. For those who are circumcised do not even watch over the Torah, but they wish to have you circumcised so that they can boast in your flesh. And as for me, let it not be that I should boast except in the cross of our Master Yeshua Messiah. And so he goes on with all kind of other, self-righteous condemnation of the Jerusalem assembly that are urging the Galatians to come into Torah observance. So this is the nature of the controversy. We do get a little bit more information in Acts as to who the some was that came from James. Acts 15:1, it says, certain men came down from Yehuda and were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the practice of Moshe, you are unable to be saved. So when Shaul and Barnabas had no small dissension and dispute with them, they arranged for Saul and Barnabas and certain others of them to go up to Jerusalem to the emissaries and the elders about this question. So this is in Galatians chapter 2 when it says that the reason that he went to Jerusalem on his second trip to consult with James, Kepha, and John was because of these false brothers. So these false brothers are the men in Acts 15. Now I put false brothers in quotation marks because it's obvious that the false brothers are actually probably the actual disciples, maybe even the apostles of Yeshua himself. So it doesn't appear that they are really false brothers. That's just what Paul's calling them. We'll look more deeply into Acts, but we'll just kind of go over this briefly. Acts 15:13, and after they were silent, now this is when he was in Jerusalem. After they were silent, Yaakov answered and said, men, brothers, listen to me. He goes into a story about the prophecies about the bringing salvation to the Gentiles, and he says, therefore I judge that we should not trouble those from among the Gentiles who are turning to Elohim, but that we should write them to abstain from the defilements of idol, and from whoring, and from what is strangled, and from blood, because from ancient generations Moshe has in every city those proclaiming him, being read in the congregations every Sabbath. Then it seemed to be good to the emissaries and elders, and all the assembly to send chosen men from among them to Antioch with Shaul and Barnabas, Yehuda being called, Barsabba and Silas, leading men among the brothers. Okay, so this is before the confrontation written about in the second part of chapter 2 of Galatians. So Keith is talking about when he went to Jerusalem, they saw the favor that had been given to him to be the apostle to the Gentiles. This is that meeting. So from the Jerusalem Assembly's perspective, this issue has been settled. And so they are sending back some of the members of the assembly back to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. And the determination is that new Gentiles that are just turning into the faith. Now keep in mind, these guys there was a 3-year process in which someone like a new believer would go from being a Gentile on the outside to coming into the body. For 3 years, there was a probationary period before they became a full member. So James is saying, okay, for those that are turning to Elohim, just to get their foot in the door, in other words, they are to abstain from defilements of idols, which would include meat sacrificed to idols, from whoring or fornication, from what is strangled, which, I think that, all of this, and from blood. I mean, this all has to do with dietary regulations, except for the fornication part. So, knowing what we know about the early believers in Yeshua, the terms were basically this. You have to eat a vegetarian diet, and you have to stay away from fornication, just to get your foot in the door. And the reason is because in the green, from ancient generations, Moshe is read in every city. So in other words, following the dietary regulations and the regulation on fornication and keeping away from idols, that's the minimum requirements to get you in the door. That does not get you into full membership status. That gets you started on the probationary period. You'll have 3 years where Moses is being read to you every Shabbat for you to gradually come into agreement. Now, apparently what the other people were telling the people at Galatia is that they had to get circumcised before they could even start the process. That was the issue. And James is saying, no, we can go ahead and let them come in as long as they agree to keep the dietary regulations, stay away from idols, and stay away from fornication. That was the agreement. And so when Paul and Barnabas and Silas and other unnamed leading men among the brothers, when they went back to Antioch to give that message, that's what the understanding was. Then, at some future day, Kepha is there eating with these men, with the assembly there in Antioch. And then somebody shows up from James and points out that these guys are not following these regulations. And we know that from Paul's letters, because in Paul's letters, he tells people, don't worry about an idol. An idol's not anything. If you think that meat may be sacrificed to an idol, don't eat it if you're in front of somebody of weaker faith, because you don't want it to be a stumbling block for those weak in faith. But, I have this knowledge that an idol is not anything, so you can go ahead and eat it. Don't worry about it. Don't ask any questions about it. So Paul's not even following these minimum guidelines. And I think that that's what Kepha found out, and I think that's the reason Kepha withdrew from table fellowship, and then that's what caused Paul to get up in Kepha's face, was because they were exposing Paul. It had nothing to do with Kepha withdrawing. It's because when Kepha withdrew, and he was telling the people, "Hey, look, you've been led, astray. You're not doing. You don't understand what the judgment was that we passed in Jerusalem." It exposed Paul as being a liar, and so that's why Paul had this outing with it brought his disagreement out into the open with Kepha. It says also in Acts 15, this is after they went to Antioch. It says that Paul suggested that, the brothers that went with them from Jerusalem to Antioch, they eventually left. And so, but Silas ended up staying. Okay, here it is. So, and having spent some time, they were sent back in peace from the brothers to the emissaries. That's verse 33. But it seemed good to Silas to remain. So everyone else went back to Jerusalem except for Silas and Paul and Barnabas. And then the next verse, 35, says, Paul and Barnabas continued in Antioch, teaching and bringing with many others also the good news, the word of Yeshua. And after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us now go back and visit our brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of Yeshua and see how they are." And Barnabas proposed to take with them Yochanan, or John called Mark. But Saul thought that it was not fit to take with them the one who had withdrew from them in Pamphylia, and had not gone with them to the work. And a sharp feeling therefore came to be, so that they parted from one another. So Barnabas and Paul had this argument, and Barnabas and Paul split up. So Barnabas went with Mark and sailed to Cyprus, and Saul chose Silas and went off, being committed by the brothers to the favor of Elohim, and he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the assemblies. Okay, so what happened here? This is a much different version than what we get in Galatians. Obviously, this is the same argument, because you notice that in the book of Galatians, it says that Barnabas was led away. That he, the split was between Paul and Barnabas. Barnabas, according to Paul, was led astray by the other Jews. And that's what you see here. You see that Barnabas is going away with John Mark, who is the other Jew. So now we're beginning to see who the son from James was. It was John Mark. John Mark was the one that came to Galatia and caused Kepha to withdraw from the table fellowship. But see, Luke in the book of Acts, he's glossing over this. He's not mentioning the disagreement between Kepha and Paul. Now it's the disagreement between Paul and John Mark and Barnabas. And so they're splitting up. But this is a much different story than what we get in Galatians. Now, Galatians, of course, is a first-hand account, because it's generally regarded as a more reliable source because it comes straight from Paul, a first-hand account. Granted, Luke may have been there, so this may be a first-hand account too, but they're definitely two different issues. It's not the same story. Okay, Acts 15. I'm sorry. Now, so this slide is just basically saying so Mark is the son. The son that came from James is Mark. And again, you see where Barnabas is led astray, and then you have Barnabas going with Mark. Now, if we go back a little bit further in Acts, we see what Paul was talking about when he's saying that Mark was the one that withdrew from them in Pamphylia. Acts 13:13 says, having put out from Paphos, Shaul and them with him came to Perge in Pamphylia, and Yochanan, having left them, returned to Jerusalem. So see, now you see that Yochanan is part of this Jerusalem assembly. He's going back to Jerusalem, and that's why the author of Acts is saying the reason that Paul didn't want to go with John Mark is because John Mark had left them to go to Jerusalem instead of staying with them. So it may very well be that John Mark knew something wasn't right with Saul in Acts 13:13, goes back to Jerusalem, to the Jerusalem assembly, and reports to James and the other apostles and says, look guys, something's up with Paul. There's something going on. So then John Mark and probably some others from James, they go up to Galatia, up to Antioch, they go up to Antioch to investigate what it is that John Mark reported to them. And then when they get to Antioch, Kepha's already there. Kepha gets wind of what's going on. Kepha withdraws from table fellowship, and then that's when the fireworks happen. So now you see why the real reason that Paul didn't want to go with John Mark is because John Mark was the one that exposed him. So now who is John Mark? Well, we go a little bit further back in Acts, to Acts 12:12. Interesting that it's Acts 13:13 and Acts 12:12 that we get this information from. But it says, and having realized this, okay, here's what happened. So Kepha was in prison. An angel comes and sets Kepha free, leads him out of the prison, gets him out to the street, and the angel disappears. And so now here's Kepha. He's coming out of this vision with the angel, and suddenly he's standing there in the street, and he figures out what's going on. He says, having realized this, he went to the house of Miriam, the mother of John, who was also called Mark, where many had gathered to pray, and Kepha told them how the master brought him out of the prison, and he said, report this to James and to the brothers. Okay, now this is an interesting passage here too, because who was James's brothers? Well, we know who one of his brothers was. His brother was Yeshua. What was James and Yeshua's mother's name? Miriam. So why is Kepha going to Miriam, the mother of John Mark, looking for James? would it not make more sense that Kepha went to Miriam, the mother of James, looking for James? So what this could mean, I mean, it's not just James, he's looking for James and the brothers. Now we could look at this and say, well, the brothers are the other believers. I think it's James and the other brothers of Yeshua. James, Jude, the brothers themselves. Simon. So it's very likely that John Mark is an actual family member of Yeshua. So one of Yeshua's, this person who could potentially be an actual family member of Yeshua, is the one that came up to Antioch and outed Paul. So now you see why Paul was in such an uproar. See, the book of Galatians was probably meant to be damage control before the word spread around to everybody that Paul had been found to be an apostate. And that's why Paul was so in a rage about it. So Acts 12:12 tells you who Mark is, and now we know who, in Galatians 2:12, who the identity of the sum is, or at least one member of the sum. And he was a member of the circumcision party, which of course would have been the Jerusalem assembly. Okay, so that's it for this video. Sorry I stumbled over a little bit. It's been a long day. I'm doing this late at night. But thank you for listening, and when we return, we'll get more into what the book of Acts says, and then we'll also look at some of Paul's other letters that give us a little bit more information about what's going on. And then we're also going to see how the book of Galatians relates to the book of James. So thank you for listening, and shalom.